Under the dim light of a late winter afternoon, the gilded doors of Buckingham Palace stood motionless, a facade of royal calm masking a storm that had been brewing behind closed doors for months. It was just after 4 p.m. when the palace press office, with an air of calculated precision, sent out an email that would ricochet through newsrooms across the globe in seconds. The subject line was short, almost deceptively unremarkable. Official statement regarding the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Those few words concealed the magnitude of what was inside. When journalists opened the message, the language was both coldly formal and historically seismic. The royal family had decided, with immediate effect, to strip Prince Harry and Meghan Markle of all remaining royal titles, including their high-profile designations as the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. It was the kind of decision that didn't just rewrite the couple's relationship with the monarchy. It tore a page out of royal history itself. For years, whispers of this possibility had floated in the air, dismissed by many as idle speculation or media sensationalism. After all, completely removing royal titles from a member of the family, especially a direct descendant of the monarch, was nearly unheard of in the modern era. Even the abdication crisis of 1936, when Edward VIII gave up the throne for Wallis Simpson, had not resulted in such a total erasure of ceremonial identity. But here it was, in black and white, sanctioned by King Charles III himself, with the full backing of the most senior members of the royal household. This was not a half measure. It was a final, irrevocable severing. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The announcement landed like a hammer blow. Within minutes, it was trending at the top of global social media platforms. Television anchors interrupted programming, tabloid websites lit up with flashing banners, and legal analysts were brought in to explain the rarely used mechanisms behind the revocation of royal styles and titles. The world wanted to know what had happened behind palace walls to bring about such a drastic move. And why now? Was this the culmination of years of public defiance? Or had a private scandal finally pushed the royal family past the point of no return? Behind the public shock was a quieter, more intimate drama. Those who had been close to Harry and Meghan since their 2018 wedding knew the arc of this story well. The honeymoon period of glowing headlines and global adoration. The slow cooling of relations as differences in vision and protocol emerged. The sharp rupture in 2020 with their decision to step back from official duties. And the years of barbed interviews, docuseries, and memoir excerpts that followed. Every step seemed to drive a deeper wedge between the Sussexes and the institution that had once wrapped them in centuries-old tradition. This statement was not an impulsive decision made over tea and biscuits in the drawing room. It was the end result of meticulous deliberation, where the palace weighed not just family bonds but the reputation and stability of the crown itself. In the hours before the announcement, the corridors of Buckingham Palace were said to be unusually tense. Staff who normally glided through their duties with the smooth detachment of seasoned professionals spoke in hushed tones. Couriers moved sealed envelopes between offices, aides clutched folders thick with briefing papers, and the king's private secretary was seen in back-to-back meetings with senior legal counsel. The decision had been signed off days earlier, but the exact timing of its release was strategic. Palace insiders knew the shockwave would dominate the news cycle for days, perhaps weeks. They also knew it would invite scrutiny not just of Harry and Meghan's actions, but of the royal family's own handling of the saga. The statement itself was brief, just under 3 paragraphs, but each sentence had been crafted with precision. It cited repeated breaches of royal protocol and behavior inconsistent with the responsibilities of their positions. It made clear that the decision was final, and that Harry and Meghan would no longer represent the monarchy in any capacity. There was no mention of reconciliation, no suggestion of a path back, only a closing of the book. The language was polite but unyielding, the kind of formality that in royal terms is often more devastating than overt condemnation. Outside the palace gates, a crowd began to gather almost as soon as the news broke. Tourists who had been posing for photos found themselves swept up in an impromptu media spectacle. Microphones were pushed into the faces of visitors from Canada, Australia, South Africa, nations where the British monarchy still carried symbolic weight. Some expressed sadness, calling it a family tragedy that had played out too publicly. Others were less sympathetic, arguing that Harry and Meghan had courted this outcome by consistently undermining the very institution they had once sworn to serve. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in the sunlit calm of California, the mood was said to be markedly different. Friends of the couple claimed that Meghan had anticipated such a move for months, perhaps even prepared for it, as part of a larger rebranding strategy. Harry, however, was believed to be devastated, not because of the loss of titles themselves, but because of what it represented, the erasure of his formal place in the structure of the family he had been born into. In the monarchy, titles are not just decorative. They are markers of identity, status, and historical continuity. Without them, Harry and Meghan were no longer senior royals in exile. They were simply Harry and Meghan, private citizens, famous but officially disconnected from the centuries-old lineage they had once embodied. The shock for many was that the royal family had chosen to take this step now, at a time when public opinion was already fractured over the monarchy's relevance. Some commentators argued that the decision was a show of strength, proof that the institution would not be held hostage by celebrity influence. Others saw it as petty, an unnecessary escalation in a feud that could have been left to cool with time. The divide in perception reflected a larger question that has haunted the monarchy for decades. Is it an unshakable pillar of tradition or a living institution that must adapt and compromise to survive? As night fell over London on the day of the announcement, the palace remained silent beyond its initial statement. No further comment was offered, and no interviews were given. The royal standard still flew above the building, a reminder that the machinery of the monarchy carried on regardless of individual departures or losses. But for those who had followed the saga of Harry and Meghan from the beginning, the air felt different, as though an invisible line had been crossed, one that could never be uncrossed. This was more than a story about titles. It was about identity, belonging, and the power dynamics of one of the world's most scrutinized families. It was about the clash between tradition and autonomy, duty and personal freedom. And it was about the inescapable truth that no matter how far you run from the palace gates, the shadows of the crown have a way of following you. The world was left to wonder what would come next for Harry and Meghan, for the monarchy, and for the very idea of royalty in the modern age. In the days and weeks leading up to the announcement, the atmosphere within the royal household was almost eerily deceptive. On the surface, life appeared to go on as usual. Official engagements were carried out with the same precision and grace expected of the institution. Public appearances were carefully choreographed, and behind the smiles and handshakes, there was no hint of the earthquake that was about to rattle the monarchy to its core. Yet for those embedded deep within palace operations, the tension was palpable, like the faint smell of smoke before a fire becomes visible. This was the calm before the storm, a period marked by a strange, calculated stillness. Harry and Meghan were thousands of miles away, living their lives under the Californian sun, appearing at public events, delivering speeches, signing deals, and building their own brand independent of the crown. But unbeknown to most of the public, subtle lines of communication between them and the palace had almost entirely broken down. What had once been formal but cordial exchanges had dwindled into silence, punctuated only by terse, lawyer-vetted messages. Inside Buckingham Palace, meetings were taking place with a level of secrecy normally reserved for matters of state security. The king's private advisors, legal experts, and senior courtiers convened repeatedly in rooms with heavy drapes and locked doors. Each session seemed to stretch for hours, often concluding without smiles or easy reassurances. Notes from these gatherings were not circulated via email, but delivered in sealed envelopes to only the most trusted individuals. To the outside world, it was business as usual. Inside, it was a slow march toward a moment that many feared would be historic and irreversible. This period before the announcement was not without its flashpoints. Harry's memoir had left deep wounds that had yet to scab over, with passages that directly challenged the credibility and character of senior royals. Meghan's interviews, whether in podcasts or with high-profile journalists, continued to land like small grenades in the British press. While none of these events alone might have provoked the ultimate penalty, together they formed a pattern, a relentless chipping away at the institution's image. The palace, a body accustomed to weathering storms with stoicism, began to see these incidents not as isolated moments of personal expression, but as part of a sustained campaign that threatened the monarchy's stability. For Harry and Meghan, the absence of any visible pushback from the royal family may have been misinterpreted as tolerance. The couple had grown accustomed to speaking freely, shaping their narrative without immediate royal correction. But inside the palace, restraint was not a sign of acceptance, it was strategy. The monarchy had learned over centuries that timing is everything. Acting too soon could backfire. Acting too late could allow irreparable damage. In this case, they were waiting for the right moment when public opinion, legal justification, and internal consensus aligned. As the final weeks approached, Harry appeared at several public events in the United States, speaking on topics close to his heart. Meghan continued to attend functions, often in glamorous settings, radiating the confidence of someone firmly in control of her image. Their ventures into media production and philanthropy continued, seemingly untouched by any looming threat from across the Atlantic. But within royal circles, these appearances were being scrutinized for every word, every gesture, every association that could be framed as a breach of the delicate, unwritten contract between the royals and the crown. It was during this time that several high-ranking aides began to quietly remove certain ceremonial references to the couple from official planning documents. Invitations to major state events were drafted without their names. Their profiles on official royal channels were stripped back, their roles redefined in the most minimalistic terms. These changes were subtle, unlikely to be noticed by the general public, but to insiders, they were clear signs that the palace was preparing to make a decisive move. The mood inside Buckingham Palace shifted further after a series of closed-door briefings with constitutional experts. These were not simply advisory meetings. They were forensic examinations of precedent, legality, and the potential repercussions of stripping titles from a royal couple. The questions being discussed were monumental. Would this create a legal challenge? Could the couple use their remaining influence to counteract the decision? How would this be perceived across the Commonwealth? By the end of these sessions, a conclusion began to form, not with the bluster of a rash decision, but with the cold certainty of an inevitable outcome. Even as these preparations continued, there were moments of hesitation. Some advisors worried about the optics of such a move, especially at a time when the monarchy was facing broader questions about its relevance. Stripping titles could be seen as vindictive, a personal vendetta rather than an act of institutional necessity. But the other side argued that failure to act would set a dangerous precedent, that one could reap the privileges of royal association without upholding the standards and duties it demanded. This debate was fierce, but ultimately, the weight of tradition, protocol, and the perceived need to protect the monarchy's dignity tipped the scales toward decisive action. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan appeared to be living in a different reality. Friends later claimed that, while Meghan may have suspected something was in motion, Harry was caught off guard by the seriousness of the palace's intent. Their inner circle in California reportedly dismissed rumors of title removal as exaggerated tabloid fodder. After all, such a step was rare, bordering on unheard of. But those who had studied the history of the monarchy knew that when the crown moved slowly, it often struck with finality. The final days before the announcement were marked by a silence so absolute, it was almost oppressive. No warnings were given. No private calls made to soften the blow. The palace had decided that this was a matter for public, not private, handling. The calm that hung over royal operations was not the peace of resolution, but the quiet before a thunderclap, one that, when it came, would be heard around the world. When the moment finally arrived, it would not feel sudden to those who had been watching closely. It would feel like the culmination of years of conflict, frustration, and diverging paths. The calm before the storm was over, and the royal family was about to step into one of its most defining and controversial chapters in recent memory. The walls of Buckingham Palace have witnessed more than a century of political negotiations, private grief, and high-stakes decisions that shaped the fate of the monarchy. Yet, even within such a storied setting, the atmosphere inside one particular chamber in recent months was unlike anything many of its occupants had ever experienced. This was the inner sanctum, where King Charles, senior royals, and his most trusted advisors met to decide on matters that could alter not only the image of the royal family, but its very definition in the modern age. The decision to strip Harry and Meghan of their titles did not spring from a single meeting. It was the product of a series of carefully orchestrated sessions, each more tense than the last. The setting for these discussions was deliberately chosen for its privacy and gravitas. The room itself was lined with heavy, centuries-old curtains that muted the noise from the busy corridors beyond. A massive oak table dominated the space, its polished surface reflecting the faces of those gathered around it. On some days, the air was thick with the scent of fresh wax polish and leather-bound folders. On others, the smell of strong tea and freshly brewed coffee lingered as aides refilled cups during long hours of debate. At the head of the table sat the king, not as a symbolic figurehead, but as a man wrestling with the weight of his dual role, father and sovereign. To his right, Prince William's posture was rigid, his expression unreadable, yet his presence a silent declaration that he intended to have a say in how the institution handled the Sussex dilemma. Across from them sat Princess Anne, her sharp, no-nonsense demeanor cutting through the formal pleasantries, pressing for decisions grounded in precedent rather than sentiment. The Lord Chamberlain, private secretaries, and senior legal counsel completed the circle, each armed with meticulously prepared documents, briefing notes, and historical records. The discussions began with a forensic review of the events that had led them here. Aides presented timelines, starting from the couple's departure in 2020 and stretching through their most recent public engagements. Each instance of perceived protocol breach was laid out like evidence in a courtroom. Controversial interviews, commercial deals tied to royal branding, speeches that strayed into political territory, and the continuous drip of memoir revelations. Some around the table were visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as certain incidents were replayed or read aloud. Others listened with an air of grim vindication, as if confirming what they had long suspected. As the sessions progressed, the language shifted from analysis to strategy. What options were available? Could there be a middle path, a suspension rather than a full removal? Should the titles be stripped but the styles retained? Could such a move be framed in a way that would appear fair and proportionate to the public? Each question sparked rounds of debate, the answers often circling back to one central concern: the preservation of the monarchy's dignity and authority. It was Princess Anne, according to those familiar with the discussions, who repeatedly pressed the point that half measures would only prolong the damage. She argued that leaving any royal designation in place would allow the couple to continue trading on their connection to the crown while disregarding the standards it required. Her view was blunt. If the monarchy was to maintain credibility, it needed to act decisively, no matter the personal cost to family relationships. Prince William's contributions were more measured but no less firm. While careful not to let personal grievances dominate his arguments, he made it clear that the monarchy could not survive in an environment where senior members acted without accountability. His position reflected not only his role as heir to the throne, but also a generational concern about how younger audiences perceived the institution. The Sussexes, in his view, had transformed their royal identities into a global brand that operated independently and sometimes in opposition to the crown. Allowing that to continue, he argued, would erode the foundation of the monarchy over time. King Charles listened more than he spoke in these sessions, a habit that allowed him to absorb each perspective before weighing in. When he did speak, his words carried the authority of someone acutely aware that history would judge his reign by how he navigated this turbulent chapter. He was said to have acknowledged the personal difficulty of the decision. Harry was not just a royal subject, but his son. Yet he also made clear that the crown was bigger than any individual, even family. It was this balance between personal affection and institutional duty that gave the meetings their quiet intensity. The legal advisors played a critical role in grounding the discussions in constitutional reality. They explained that while the removal of titles was rare, it was not without precedent. Historical examples were cited, from wartime cases involving treason to instances where royals had entered into marriages or businesses deemed incompatible with their duties. The process, they stressed, had to be airtight, avoiding any possibility of legal challenge. They drafted potential statements, scrutinizing every word for both accuracy and impact, mindful that the announcement would be dissected by media and historians alike. Public relations strategists added another layer of complexity to the debate. They conducted polling to gauge public sentiment, presenting data that revealed a deep divide. Older generations were more likely to support decisive action, seeing it as a defense of tradition. Younger audiences were split, some sympathetic to Harry and Meghan's independence, others critical of their constant public criticisms of the monarchy. The challenge was to frame the decision in a way that would resonate across these divides, presenting it not as punishment, but as a necessary measure to protect the institution's integrity. Through it all, the meetings maintained an air of formality, but the emotional undercurrents were unmistakable. There were moments when the room fell into complete silence after a particularly painful revelation or pointed remark. At times, the king's eyes lingered on the table, as if staring at the polished wood might make the choice before him less impossible. By the final meeting, the conclusion had crystallized. There would be no partial measures, no probationary period. The removal would be total, immediate, and final. Harry and Meghan would be informed only when the machinery of the announcement was ready to move. It was not cruelty, the participants told themselves. It was clarity. The crown could not afford ambiguity. The king rose from the table, signaling the end of the discussion. The courtiers gathered their papers, the legal team prepared the final drafts, and the communications office began crafting the release that would soon dominate headlines around the world. Behind those closed doors, the decision had been made. Outside, the public still believed the calm would hold. They had no idea that within days, the storm would break. In every royal crisis, there comes a moment when the balance tips, when the slow accumulation of grievances and missteps transforms into an undeniable imperative to act. For the royal family, that moment with Harry and Meghan had been inching closer for years, but the final straw arrived not with a single explosive scandal, but with a series of calculated misjudgments that, when taken together, convinced the palace there was no going back. It was the culmination of an unbroken pattern. Interviews that bypassed the palace press office, commercial projects that leaned heavily on royal associations, and public statements that strayed into areas senior royals traditionally avoided. The first trigger came from an international event where Meghan, appearing as a keynote speaker, made pointed remarks that could be interpreted as criticism of current government policy. While she avoided naming the United Kingdom directly, the political undertone was unmistakable to anyone listening. It was the sort of statement that would have caused concern coming from any royal, but in the context of the Sussexes' already strained relationship with the crown, it landed like a warning flare. Senior aides flagged it immediately, noting that it crossed the fine line between advocacy and political commentary that members of the royal family are bound to avoid. Not long after, Harry signed on to a high-profile media project that prominently featured his life as a royal. While there was no explicit breach of contract with the palace, the promotional materials leaned heavily on imagery from his official duties, moments, events, and settings that belonged to the institution, not to any individual. This raised alarm bells in the palace legal department, who saw it as another example of the couple profiting directly from their former positions while publicly insisting they had left that world behind. Then came a podcast appearance that ignited a storm in the British press. Meghan, in a casual but unmistakably pointed remark, suggested that her time within the royal family had been akin to living under a constant shadow, where every move was scrutinized and every word weaponized. The palace had learned to absorb such criticisms with measured silence, but this time the tone was sharper, more accusatory, and paired with a clear commercial push for her brand. It was this blending of personal grievance with public promotion that many inside the palace saw as a direct undermining of the monarchy's dignity. In the weeks that followed, another breach emerged, this time more subtle but equally damaging. Meghan had accepted an award from an American foundation, citing her contributions to advancing gender equality. In her acceptance speech, she made repeated references to breaking free from outdated structures and standing firm against the weight of centuries-old expectations. While she never mentioned the monarchy by name, the implication was obvious. The British press pounced, running headlines that left little doubt as to whom she was referring. What troubled the palace most was not the content of these remarks individually, but the accumulation of them. the sense that every public engagement by the couple was being used, consciously or unconsciously, to reinforce a narrative of the monarchy as archaic and oppressive. For an institution built on symbolism, image, and continuity, this was a slow, corrosive attack that could not be ignored. Behind closed doors, aides began compiling a dossier. It was a thick folder of transcripts, media clippings, and legal opinions, meticulously organized by date and type of infraction. Each entry was accompanied by an assessment of its potential impact on the monarchy's reputation and its violation of established protocol. Some entries were minor, an offhand comment, an Instagram post with a questionable caption. Others were more serious, like the use of royal imagery in commercial ventures or statements that could be seen as political endorsements. The final pages of the dossier contained the most damaging incidents, a yet-to-be-aired documentary project that insiders believed would paint a deeply critical picture of the royal family. Whispers about the production had been circulating for months, but it was the discovery that private moments from Harry's time as a working royal might be included, moments never intended for public release, that pushed the palace into a defensive posture. There was a growing fear that once the project aired, the damage would be irreparable. This fear was compounded by reports from contacts in the entertainment industry that the Sussexes had been negotiating partnerships contingent on their continued use of the Duke and Duchess titles. Even if those deals were technically compliant with the agreement made when they stepped back from royal duties, the optics were clear. Their marketability was still tied to the very institution they often criticized. For the monarchy's defenders, this was an intolerable contradiction. The tipping point came during a confidential briefing between senior palace staff and the king. The legal team presented the dossier in its entirety, laying out a timeline of breaches that left little room for ambiguity. Each entry was accompanied by a recommendation. Warnings could be issued, public rebuttals could be made, but the consensus was that these measures would be temporary fixes. The only way to protect the monarchy in the long term, they argued, was to remove the couple's formal royal identity altogether. The king's reaction was measured but decisive. He listened to each point, asked questions, and requested clarification on the potential backlash. Advisors were frank. The decision would split public opinion, inflame the couple's supporters, and invite accusations of vindictiveness. But they also warned that hesitation could allow further erosion of the monarchy's authority. It was a choice between enduring a sharp, painful blow now or risking a slow decline in the institution's standing. In that moment, the rationale for the decision became clear. It was not about silencing Harry and Meghan, nor was it about erasing them from history. It was about drawing a definitive line, one that would signal to the world that royal privilege comes with unshakable responsibility, and that those who repeatedly reject the latter cannot indefinitely retain the former. The king gave the order for the process to move forward. The legal team began drafting the necessary documents, while the communications office prepared a statement that would frame the move not as retaliation, but as a matter of institutional integrity. The machinery of the palace, once slow and deliberate, shifted into a higher gear. Deadlines were set, media strategies finalized, and security protocols updated to ensure the announcement could be made without leaks. The final straw had been reached, and the decision was no longer theoretical. It was in motion, unstoppable, and within days it would leave the royal family and the world irrevocably changed. The morning the statement dropped began with an unusual stillness inside Buckingham Palace. Staff members went about their duties with a quiet efficiency, but the usual hum of conversation was absent. Those who knew what was about to happen kept their expressions neutral, avoiding eye contact that might betray the gravity of the moment. The decision had been made days earlier, but until the statement was released to the world, there was a faint possibility, however unrealistic, that something might change. That possibility dissolved as soon as the communications team convened in the press office at 9 a.m. sharp, sealing the final draft into envelopes and preparing the digital release for distribution. The statement itself had been through countless revisions, each word weighed for both legal precision and public perception. The tone had to be formal but not cold, definitive but not vindictive. It was a balancing act the palace had mastered over centuries, delivering monumental news in language that avoided spectacle, allowing the gravity of the content to speak for itself. The final version consisted of 3 short paragraphs. On the surface, it was restrained. In reality, it carried the weight of a verdict. At exactly 11 a.m. London time, the statement was posted on the official royal family website and sent directly to global media outlets. For most people, it appeared as a push notification on their phones. Official palace statement on the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Those who tapped it were met with words that would immediately alter the Sussexes' standing in history. The statement confirmed that, effective immediately, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were to be stripped of all remaining royal titles and privileges, including their status as Duke and Duchess of Sussex. It cited repeated breaches of established protocol and conduct inconsistent with the responsibilities of royal positions as the grounds for the decision. There was no elaboration, no personal commentary, no opening for negotiation. It was absolute. Within minutes, newsrooms around the world went into overdrive. Television anchors interrupted scheduled programming, newspapers rushed to update their websites, and social media exploded with commentary, speculation, and outrage. The speed with which the story spread was a testament to the enduring power of the monarchy as both an institution and a global symbol. Even in countries far removed from the day-to-day relevance of the royal family, the news carried a sense of historical weight. Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd began to swell almost immediately. Tourists who had been taking photographs now pressed up against the black railings, their attention fixed on the press corps gathering near the gates. Microphones, cameras, and live-streaming rigs jostled for position as journalists shouted questions that went unanswered. The palace had no intention of providing live commentary. The statement was the only official word, and it would remain so. In California, the couple learned of the announcement at the same time as the public. Despite whispers that they had been warned in advance, sources close to the palace insisted there had been no direct communication in the final days. For Harry, the news was said to have landed with a heavy finality. Even though his relationship with the institution had been fractured for years, the titles represented an unbroken thread connecting him to the life he had known since birth. For Meghan, reactions were harder to read. Those who knew her claimed she had expected this moment eventually, though the suddenness of the announcement took her by surprise. In the hours following the release, the palace's communications team monitored the unfolding media storm from behind closed doors. Screens displayed live coverage from British, American, and Commonwealth news outlets, each spinning the decision through its own cultural and political lens. In the United Kingdom, traditionalists largely praised the move as overdue, framing it as a necessary step to protect the monarchy's reputation. In parts of the Commonwealth, the reaction was more complicated, with some voices framing it as an act of exclusion and others as an assertion of royal discipline. Inside the palace, senior staff gathered for a brief follow-up meeting in the afternoon to assess the initial wave of public reaction. No one appeared triumphant. This was not a decision that brought satisfaction. Rather, there was a sense of relief that a long and painful chapter had reached its conclusion, paired with an understanding that the fallout would be felt for months, possibly years. Advisors noted that the statement's brevity had worked in their favor, leaving little room for misinterpretation or direct rebuttal. By evening, the visual symbols of the decision began to emerge. On the official royal family website, the Sussexes' profiles were quietly updated, their titles removed from headers and biographies. In official planning documents for upcoming events, their names were absent. Ceremonial photographs that once featured them in prominent positions were subtly replaced with others in which they were absent or in the background. These were quiet, almost invisible acts to the casual observer, but to those familiar with royal protocol, they signaled that the decision was both final and irreversible. The public, however, was far from done talking. Commentators debated whether this was a decisive act of leadership or a dangerous escalation in a family feud played out on a global stage. Supporters of the couple flooded social media with messages of solidarity, using hashtags to rally against what they saw as an injustice. Critics of the Sussexes argued that the decision was a natural consequence of their choices over the last several years. The divide in public opinion was sharp, reflecting deeper cultural and generational differences in how people viewed the monarchy. As night fell over London, the palace remained illuminated against the dark winter sky. The royal standard still flew, a reminder that the crown itself continued on, unchanged in its constitutional role. Yet for many, the day's events marked a turning point, a moment when the institution demonstrated its willingness to enforce its boundaries, even against its own. The statement had been released, the decision made. The rest would be played out not in the hushed rooms of the palace, but in the court of public opinion, where the repercussions were just beginning to take shape. The global media reaction to the palace's announcement was instantaneous and relentless, a cascading wave of coverage that seemed to engulf every corner of the news cycle. Within moments of the statement's release, headlines were flashing across television screens in London, New York, Sydney, Johannesburg, and Toronto. On social media, the news spread even faster, shared and reshared with commentary ranging from the fiercely supportive to the sharply critical. It was as though the entire world had been waiting for this exact moment, and now that it had arrived, no one could look away. In the United Kingdom, major broadcasters broke into scheduled programming to cover the development in real time. BBC presenters, their expressions carefully neutral, read the statement aloud before cutting to royal correspondents stationed outside Buckingham Palace. ITV and Sky News rolled out special graphics and gathered panels of royal historians, constitutional experts, and former palace staff to offer instant analysis. Newspapers scrambled to get updated editions into print. By the following morning, every front page was dominated by the same story, some with restrained headlines, others with bold, emotional declarations about the end of the Sussex chapter in royal history. Across the Atlantic, American networks framed the announcement through a different lens. Morning talk shows treated it as both a serious political development and a celebrity bombshell, toggling between constitutional implications and the couple's brand value in Hollywood. Major cable networks convened panels that blended political commentators with entertainment reporters, dissecting not only the palace's motives, but also the potential impact on the couple's media ventures. In New York's Times Square, the story ran across the giant digital billboards, visible to thousands of pedestrians who paused to take photos of the breaking headline. In the Commonwealth nations, the reaction was more nuanced. In Canada, news anchors spoke of the deep historical ties between the monarchy and the country, noting the symbolic weight of such a decisive move. Some political commentators used the announcement to revisit debates about Canada's relationship with the crown, while others focused on the personal toll such a break might have on family dynamics. In Australia, where Republican sentiments have been simmering for years, the decision reignited discussions about the monarchy's future. Some commentators saw it as evidence of the institution's rigidity, while others praised it as a necessary enforcement of standards. In Caribbean nations, the decision was met with mixed feelings. Some saw it as proof of the monarchy's unwillingness to modernize, while others viewed it as irrelevant to their own evolving national identities. On social media, the conversation was even more polarized. Supporters of Harry and Meghan, many using hashtags that trended globally within hours, accused the palace of silencing two people who had dared to speak their truth. Memes, reaction videos, and long threads analyzing every line of the statement flooded platforms like X, Instagram, and TikTok. Others took the opposite stance, posting clips of past interviews and speeches by the couple as evidence of why the palace's decision was justified. Influencers and commentators with large followings weighed in, further amplifying the divide. For news organizations, this was a ratings windfall. Talk shows devoted entire segments to the drama. Newspapers ran multi-page spreads, and online outlets pushed out article after article to feed the insatiable demand for updates. Headlines speculated on the couple's next moves, whether they might pursue legal action, and how their public image might shift in the aftermath. Analysts began charting the likely impact on their future projects, from streaming deals to charitable partnerships, noting that while their star power might remain intact, their royal cachet had been fundamentally altered. Back in London, the media presence outside Buckingham Palace reached near chaotic levels. Satellite vans lined the streets, cables snaked across the pavement, and journalists conducted live stand-ups against the backdrop of the gates. Tourists and locals alike gathered in the crowd, some eager to share their opinions on camera, others simply curious to witness history in the making. The murmur of the crowd mixed with the constant whir of camera shutters and the occasional burst of shouted questions aimed at palace spokespeople, none of which received a response. As the hours passed, the coverage began to shift from the immediate shock of the announcement to a deeper examination of its meaning. Long-form opinion pieces appeared online, questioning whether this marked the start of a more assertive era for King Charles or a misstep that would further alienate younger generations. Editorial boards weighed in, with some praising the decision as an act of principled leadership and others warning it would be remembered as a needless act of division. Internationally, the story continued to dominate. In France, newspapers drew comparisons to royal scandals of the past, framing the Sussexes as modern-day exiles. In Japan, the coverage was more reserved, focusing on the procedural aspects of title removal and the parallels to their own imperial family's handling of members who married outside traditional expectations. In South Africa, commentators linked the decision to broader conversations about colonial legacy and the modern role of the British monarchy in former territories. By the end of the first 24 hours, the story had reached a saturation point few events ever achieve. It was discussed in cafes and offices, on commuter trains and dinner tables. Whether people saw it as a justifiable consequence or a public humiliation, almost everyone seemed to have an opinion. The palace had spoken, and now the world was speaking back, loudly, incessantly, and with no sign of the conversation dying down. In those first days, the sheer scale of the coverage ensured that this was no fleeting headline. The removal of Harry and Meghan's titles was now a defining moment in the monarchy's modern history, one that would be analyzed, debated, and retold for years to come. The global media frenzy had not just reported the event, it had cemented it in the public consciousness, ensuring that this chapter could never quietly fade into the background. In the immediate aftermath of the announcement, while the public and the press dissected every syllable of the palace's statement, the voices that emerged from Harry's inner circle began to shape a more personal narrative. This was the network of friends, former aides, and longtime confidants who had known him long before the world came to know him as the Duke of Sussex. They were not speaking as political commentators or royal historians. They were speaking as people who had shared private moments with Harry, who had seen him in both triumph and vulnerability, and who understood that beneath the public persona was a man facing a deeply personal loss. The first reactions were quiet, whispered to trusted journalists off the record. These were not official statements, but fragments of insight into Harry's state of mind. Some described him as stunned, even though the possibility of title removal had been circulating for months. Others said that while he had braced himself for a symbolic slap on the wrist, he had not truly believed the palace would take the most severe step available. The titles were not just ceremonial to him. They were a part of his identity since birth, woven into the fabric of who he was. Losing them was like losing a name he had always answered to. One longtime friend, speaking anonymously to a British newspaper, described receiving a late-night phone call from Harry hours after the announcement. His voice, the friend said, was heavy, as though the weight of years had settled on him all at once. He spoke less about the political implications and more about the human cost, the sense that he had been cut adrift from the family he had grown up in, the traditions that had shaped him, and the public role that had given his life a certain structure, even when he resented it. It was, the friend suggested, a kind of grief. Former members of his royal staff, who had worked with him during his years as a full-time royal, offered their own perspective. They remembered him as someone deeply committed to his causes, particularly veterans' welfare, mental health awareness, and conservation. While they acknowledged that his approach often clashed with the cautious, methodical pace of the palace, they insisted that his motivations had always been genuine. To them, the stripping of his titles was a tragedy because it would inevitably overshadow his accomplishments and redefine him in the public eye. From California, where Harry and Meghan now lived, members of their more recent circle had a different tone. Friends in the entertainment and philanthropic world spoke to American outlets about resilience, insisting that the couple would turn this into an opportunity to redefine themselves on their own terms. Some suggested that Harry had been quietly preparing for this eventuality, even if he had not expected it to come so soon. They painted a picture of a man who, while hurt, was determined to channel the shock into action. Still, There was no disguising the emotional undercurrent in these accounts. Several friends hinted at a growing isolation in Harry's life. With his ties to the palace severed and his public image under constant attack, his world had become smaller in some ways, more tightly controlled in others. The support he once had from military organizations, for example, was now in question. Without his royal titles, there were concerns about his ability to serve in certain ceremonial roles or maintain honorary positions that had been a source of pride for him. One particularly telling insight came from a former colleague who had worked closely with Harry during his military service. This person recalled that Harry's sense of duty had always been anchored in action, in doing rather than being. For him, the titles were not just ornamental. They were tools that gave him access to resources, networks, and influence. Without them, the colleague feared, Harry would struggle to have the same impact, no matter how strong his personal commitment remained. As these voices trickled into the public domain, they began to form a mosaic of Harry's inner reality, not a single, unified image, but a complex and sometimes contradictory portrait. There was sympathy for his position, criticism of the palace's decisiveness, and an undercurrent of frustration at the choices he and Meghan had made that led to this point. Even among his friends, there was an acknowledgement that the couple had taken risks with their words and actions, and that those risks had now come with the highest possible price from the institution they had left. Not all of Harry's inner circle chose to speak to the media. Some withdrew entirely, citing loyalty and the need to protect his privacy during a vulnerable time. Others spoke only in broad, nonspecific terms about his resilience, avoiding any direct criticism of the royal family. This silence, too, was telling, a recognition that any comment, however well-intentioned, could be weaponized in the ongoing public battle between the Sussexes and the palace. What became clear was that within Harry's closest circles, the decision had landed like a stone thrown into still water, its ripples touching everyone connected to him. Longtime friends in the UK worried about the permanent fracture this might cause within the family. Newer allies in the United States saw it as an opportunity for reinvention. And somewhere between those two worlds stood Harry himself, caught in the glare of a global spotlight, trying to reconcile the loss of his royal identity with the life he had chosen to build beyond the palace gates. For those who had known him the longest, the fear was that this was more than just a symbolic break. It was the severing of the last formal ties between Harry and the institution that had defined him since birth. They wondered whether, in years to come, he would look back on this day as the moment he truly became free, or as the moment something irreplaceable slipped away forever. While Harry's inner circle spoke in hushed tones and guarded reflections, Meghan's response was more strategic, shaped by a deliberate effort to control the narrative before it could solidify against her. She had spent years navigating the intense glare of public scrutiny, learning to turn moments of controversy into opportunities for redefinition. The removal of her royal titles was, in her mind, not just a setback but a challenge to be managed, reframed, and potentially even leveraged. This was not a woman inclined to retreat quietly. It was a moment that demanded a counter-narrative, and she moved quickly to construct one. Her team, a tight-knit group of publicists, legal advisors, and brand strategists, assembled almost immediately after the palace's announcement. They were no strangers to crisis communication, having weathered countless media storms since the couple's relocation to California. Within hours, they were drafting talking points, identifying sympathetic journalists, and planning the rollout of a public response that would shift the focus from the loss of titles to broader themes of personal freedom, resilience, and independence. The language they chose was careful and deliberate. There would be no direct attacks on the royal family in the immediate aftermath. That could be seen as vindictive and reactive. Instead, Meghan's approach was to position herself and Harry as individuals liberated from the constraints of an outdated institution. In early background briefings to select media outlets, her representatives hinted that the removal of titles was not a punishment, but rather the natural conclusion of a journey the couple had been on since they stepped back from royal duties. Privately, however, sources close to her admitted that Meghan was not untouched by the sting of the decision. For all her confidence in building a life outside the monarchy, the titles carried a level of prestige and influence that no amount of Hollywood success could replicate. Losing them was not just a symbolic shift, it was a practical one, affecting how she and Harry would be received in certain elite circles, especially in the philanthropic and diplomatic arenas. Yet she was determined that the public would see only composure and forward momentum. Her first public appearance after the announcement was a masterclass in controlled messaging. Meghan stepped out for a charitable event in Los Angeles wearing a sleek, understated outfit that signaled elegance without extravagance. Her remarks to the crowd avoided any reference to the titles, focusing instead on the importance of service, community, and empowerment. Cameras captured her smiling, engaging warmly with attendees, projecting an image of calm authority. The message was clear. She was not diminished, she was evolving. In parallel, her media allies began publishing op-eds and commentary pieces framing the palace's decision as evidence of the monarchy's inability to adapt to modern values. Writers sympathetic to Meghan's perspective highlighted her achievements since leaving royal life, from philanthropic initiatives to business ventures, positioning her as a role model for women forging their own paths. In this framing, the loss of royal titles was not a defeat but a mark of independence, proof that she had chosen authenticity over tradition. The counter-narrative also leaned heavily on themes of resilience in the face of adversity. Social media accounts connected to her supporters began circulating inspirational quotes, archival photos, and video clips from her past speeches about overcoming obstacles. Hashtags emphasizing strength, courage, and self-determination began trending, counterbalancing the more critical narratives dominating British tabloids. Behind the scenes, Meghan's team considered legal options as well. While there was no realistic pathway to reversing the palace's decision, there was value in signaling that the couple would defend their reputations vigorously. Letters were drafted to address what her lawyers considered defamatory statements in the press, particularly those suggesting that the title removal was linked to dishonorable behavior rather than protocol breaches. Even if these letters never reached a courtroom, they served as a reminder that she was willing to push back against narratives she deemed false. Critics of Meghan saw these moves as calculated, accusing her of spinning the situation to her advantage and deflecting responsibility for the actions that had led to the palace's decision. Supporters, however, viewed it as smart, necessary positioning in a world where public perception could make or break careers. Both perspectives underscored the same reality. Meghan understood the power of narrative, and she was determined not to let the palace's statement define hers. Behind the scenes, Meghan's team considered legal options as well. While there was no realistic pathway to reversing the palace's decision, there was value in signaling that the couple would defend their reputations vigorously. Letters were drafted to address what her lawyers considered defamatory statements in the press, particularly those suggesting that the title removal was linked to dishonorable behavior rather than protocol breaches. Even if these letters never reached a courtroom, they served as a reminder that she was willing to push back against narratives she deemed false. Critics of Meghan saw these moves as calculated, accusing her of spinning the situation to her advantage and deflecting responsibility for the actions that had led to the palace's decision. Supporters, however, viewed it as smart, necessary positioning in a world where public perception could make or break careers. Both perspectives underscored the same reality. Meghan understood the power of narrative, and she was determined not to let the palace's statement define hers. One of the more striking elements of her counter-narrative was the emphasis on legacy. In conversations with select journalists, Meghan's camp stressed that her work, both alongside Harry and independently, would outlast titles. She was portrayed as someone who measured success not by ceremonial recognition, but by tangible impact on causes she championed. This framing appealed strongly to her base in the United States, where royal status carried curiosity but not the same cultural weight it held in the UK. Yet for all the public confidence, those close to Meghan acknowledged that she was acutely aware of how the loss of titles would be interpreted globally. In diplomatic circles, in international charity networks, and even in certain entertainment industry negotiations, the distinction between Meghan Markle and the Duchess of Sussex was more than cosmetic. She knew the adjustment would require careful management, ensuring that her personal brand retained its influence even without the formal trappings of royalty. By the end of the first week after the announcement, Meghan's counter-narrative was firmly in place. To her critics, it was a polished attempt to rewrite the story. To her supporters, it was proof of her resilience and adaptability. Either way, it ensured that she remained an active participant in shaping how the world understood this moment. Not merely a subject of the palace's decision, but a woman redefining herself on her own terms. From the moment the palace's statement hit the public domain, the reaction among ordinary people was as fractured and impassioned as any royal controversy in living memory. It was not a quiet reception, nor a unified one. It was a cacophony of opinions, an immediate splitting of the public into camps that viewed the decision through entirely different lenses. In pubs, in offices, on buses, and across the endless scroll of social media, the conversation was relentless. Some saw the removal of Harry and Meghan's titles as a long-overdue assertion of discipline. Others interpreted it as an act of cruelty, a vindictive gesture from an institution unwilling to tolerate dissent. In the United Kingdom, the divide often fell along lines of tradition versus change. For older generations who had lived through decades of royal spectacle and stability, the move was seen as a necessary step to protect the crown's dignity. Many of these voices argued that the monarchy was not simply a family, but an institution with a sacred duty to uphold its image, and that Harry and Meghan had willfully undermined it. Call-in radio shows lit up with callers insisting that titles were a privilege, not a birthright, and that forfeiting them was the natural consequence of walking away from royal responsibilities. Younger voices, however, were far less unanimous. Some admired the couple's decision to leave royal life, seeing them as modern figures challenging outdated systems. In their eyes, the palace's action confirmed every criticism Harry and Meghan had made about the rigidity and lack of compassion within the institution. Others in this demographic were more critical, believing that while the couple had the right to live independently, they had been reckless in how they balanced their freedom with their ongoing use of royal status. Across the Atlantic in the United States, the reaction leaned more favorably toward the Sussexes. Here, the monarchy was largely a source of fascination rather than national identity, and the idea of stripping someone of titles felt archaic. Many Americans saw the move as punitive, even petty, framing it as an attempt to punish two individuals for choosing independence. Talk shows debated the implications for the couple's future, with some hosts openly questioning whether the royal family had done irreparable damage to its own image in the process. In Commonwealth nations, the divide took on yet another dimension. In countries like Canada and Australia, where Republican sentiment simmers beneath the surface, the controversy was sometimes used as ammunition for arguments about cutting ties to the monarchy entirely. Commentators in these nations questioned why the actions of two individuals thousands of miles away should still be of such consequence within their political and cultural landscape. Others, however, sided firmly with the palace, interpreting the decision as an enforcement of standards that transcended borders. Social media amplified every perspective, turning what might have been a week-long story into a rolling, evolving debate. On one side were hashtags celebrating the decision, filled with comments praising the monarchy's resolve and posting archival images of Harry in uniform as a reminder of what he had walked away from. On the other were hashtags of solidarity with the Sussexes, filled with clips from interviews, speeches, and charitable work that supporters argued proved their worth beyond titles. The algorithms ensured that most people saw only the voices that agreed with them, deepening the divide and hardening the rhetoric. Public opinion polls in the weeks following the announcement reflected just how deep that divide had become. In the UK, a slight majority expressed support for the palace's decision, though the margin was far from overwhelming. In the US, the numbers skewed heavily in the couple's favor. In Commonwealth nations, the results varied wildly depending on the country, the demographic, and the framing of the question. What was consistent everywhere was the level of engagement. People were paying attention, forming opinions, and arguing their positions with conviction. For the monarchy, this split in public sentiment was both a risk and a reality they had long learned to live with. No major decision in the modern era had received unanimous approval, and the royal family's advisors knew this move would be no different. The question was not whether everyone would agree, but whether the institution could withstand the backlash while maintaining the loyalty of its core supporters. For Harry and Meghan, the public divide was equally double-edged. In markets where sympathy was strong, the loss of titles could be spun as a badge of honor, proof that they had broken free from an antiquated system. In markets where opinion turned against them, it could cement a narrative of recklessness and ingratitude. Their challenge would be to speak to both audiences without alienating either, a near-impossible balancing act in the glare of global scrutiny. On the streets of London, the conversation often turned personal. Strangers debated in cafes, taxi drivers discussed it with their passengers, shopkeepers chatted with customers about whether the palace had gone too far. In small towns and villages, it was the talk of local pubs, where opinions were expressed more bluntly, sometimes in terms that revealed deeper frustrations about modern Britain, the role of the monarchy, and the influence of celebrity culture. Even weeks later, the topic refused to fade. The public divide had become a story in itself, a mirror reflecting not just opinions about Harry and Meghan, but broader questions about identity, tradition, and the meaning of loyalty in a rapidly changing world. The palace had acted, the couple had responded, and the people had taken sides. The battle for public perception was far from over, and it was being fought in every living room, news broadcast, and social feed around the globe. The decision to strip Harry and Meghan of their royal titles did not happen in a vacuum, nor was it a matter of personal preference on the part of the king or his advisors. It was bound by a complex web of tradition, law, and centuries-old precedent that guides every significant move within the monarchy. To understand why the palace's announcement carried such weight, one has to understand the protocol behind royal titles, how they are granted, how they can be removed, and why such actions are so rare in the modern era. Royal titles are not mere honorifics. They are legal and ceremonial designations tied to the structure of the monarchy itself. In the United Kingdom, titles like Duke, Duchess, Prince, and Princess are conferred by the monarch, often as a birthright or as a gift marking significant life events such as marriage. Once granted, these titles are part of the individual's formal identity, used in public functions, state documents, and legal contexts. Removing them requires more than a simple statement. It is a constitutional act, and one that is undertaken only after thorough consultation with advisors, lawyers, and, in some cases, Parliament. Historically, the removal of royal titles has been extremely rare and often linked to moments of national crisis or scandal. One of the most famous examples is the Titles Deprivation Act of 1917, which allowed King George V to strip titles from German relatives of the royal family during World War I due to political sensitivities. Another significant moment came in 1996, when Princess Diana and Sarah, Duchess of York, lost Her Royal Highness styles after divorcing Prince Charles and Prince Andrew, respectively. In both cases, the removal was tied not to personal disputes, but to formal rules about who could represent the crown. What makes Harry and Meghan's case so unusual is that it involves a complete removal of both peerage titles, Duke and Duchess of Sussex, and the HRH style, despite neither of them committing a criminal offense or being divorced from a royal marriage. The justification, as stated in the palace's announcement, was repeated breaches of established protocol, a phrase deliberately chosen to encompass a range of actions without singling out one specific incident. Protocol breaches in the royal context can take many forms. They might involve political statements, which are strictly forbidden for working royals. They could include the unauthorized use of royal insignia or imagery in commercial ventures. They might also cover breaches of confidentiality, such as revealing details of private royal conversations or engagements without approval. While the public often sees these as minor or harmless acts, within the framework of royal duty, they are taken seriously because they risk undermining the neutrality and dignity of the monarchy. The process for removing titles begins with a review by senior advisors, often led by the Lord Chamberlain or the King's private secretary. This review compiles a record of the actions in question, assesses their impact on the monarchy's reputation, and considers whether they violate any written or unwritten codes of conduct. In Harry and Meghan's case, this would have included public interviews, media projects, and speeches made after they stepped back from their roles in 2020. Once a case is built, it is presented to the monarch for consideration. While the king has the authority to grant or remove titles, He almost never acts without input from senior royals and constitutional experts. In some cases, Parliament may need to be involved, particularly if the removal of a title affects legal rights, succession, or peerage law. However, when it comes to purely honorary titles and styles, the monarch has the power to make the decision independently, as was the case here. An important distinction exists between removing a title and removing a style. The style, Her Royal Highness, is a courtesy that signifies direct service to the crown. The title of Duke or Duchess is a peerage, a formal rank within the British nobility. It is possible to remove one without the other, as happened when Harry and Meghan stopped using HRH, but retained their Sussex titles in 2020. The latest decision was significant because it removed both, leaving them without any formal royal designation. Another key element of protocol is that such decisions are final. Once a title is removed, it is not typically reinstated, except under extraordinary circumstances. This permanence is part of why the monarchy moves slowly in such matters. There is no quick reversal if the decision proves unpopular. The crown must be prepared to defend its reasoning for generations. For the public, the language of the palace's statement may have seemed deliberately vague, but in the world of royal protocol, it was precise. It established that the removal was not punitive in the sense of personal revenge, but corrective, aimed at preserving the standards and expectations of royal service. By citing breaches of protocol rather than moral failings, the palace avoided direct personal attacks, while making clear that the couple's actions were incompatible with holding titles.